Alrighty, good evening everybody. If you would, get your Bibles open up to Acts, the 16th chapter. Acts chapter 16, we will be there, I'm sure, for the entirety of our study this evening. We started just the beginning part of Acts chapter 16 last week as we are watching Paul on what is now the second preaching journey. And lots of eventful things that will happen on this particular trip. The one big difference is that he does not have the same companion as he did on the first trip. Barnabas and John Mark, we noticed last week, they went in a different direction. But Paul's got other companions on this trip, and we'll notice some of their exploits this evening. If you've got a comment or a question or anything that you want to bring out tonight that might be relevant to our study, you feel free to speak up and make those things known, and we'll work those comments and thoughts into our study together tonight. I said that you've got Paul and some of his companions here on this particular trip. Let's do some adding up and scoring. If you can remember from last week, who's Paul got with him? By the time we get here to verse 11, that's our pickup point tonight. By the time we get to verse 11 of chapter 16, who all does Paul got with him here in the boat or whatever they're using to get from place to place? All right, we've picked up Timothy. We noticed, talked about that at the beginning of chapter 16. Who else? Silas, of course, and then over here, Susan's pointed out the kind of the unspoken member of this entourage. Verse 10, which we really just kind of rush into at the end of last week. Verse 10, when Paul had seen this vision, this was the vision of the Macedonian call, immediately we sought to go on into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. So we've had a very subtle shift in pronouns there in verse 10, and that is that the author of this book is now part of the entourage. Luke has joined the band of merry men or misfits, or however you want to describe this motley crew. Luke becomes one of Paul's most trusted companions, not only because he is kind of the main documenter of Paul's travels, like the book of Acts, but also Paul's going to use Luke in other capacities and have him do things for him and be kind of a right-hand man in other places. We see Luke's name brought up in some of the epistles, how Paul utilizes him as a trusted brother in the Lord. In a lot of ways, Luke may be one of the most important figures in all of the New Testament who was not an apostle. We really just cannot be thankful enough for the work that God did through the good Dr. Luke in the pages of the New Testament. So, one of the things that verse 10 is pointing out to us is that we do probably want to kind of pay attention to those pronouns, the we's and the us's, because from now through the end of the book, it's not always going to be we and us. Sometimes it might be they and them. Luke will kind of drop in and out from time to time. In fact, when we get over here to the city of Philippi, it actually seems as if Luke maybe stays there when Paul goes on to the next place, and then of course we'll rejoin them a little bit later. So just kind of pay attention to that. So we've got at least Paul, Silas, Timothy, and Luke. That's probably kind of the core. There may have been others that aren't named, but this is Paul's preaching troupe. And what are they doing? Well, verse 11. Let's pick up with the journey then. Verse 11. So, setting sail from Troas, we made a direct voyage to Samothrace, and the following day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. And we remained in this city for some days. Now, let me put our map here back on the screen that we'll be using and following for these couple of chapters. You'll notice for those of us here in the auditorium, I've got that the little yellow circle up there. That's where we are. That's where Philippi, the region of Macedonia, is. And the main thing to maybe just kind of take note of, the reason I'm pointing this out, is because we are now officially on a whole new continent. We're in Europe now. And what we're going to see, this next story, this next account, your Bible may even have a little heading that this is going to be the account of the conversion of Lydia, is we are going to have the first European convert take place, at least the first convert on European soil is going to take place here in these next couple of verses. So this is a big deal that the gospel has been primarily over here in these Asian territories. Now we're moving to a whole new continent, whole new territory for folks to be able to hear and to learn the message of the gospel. We get a little bit of detail given here in verses 11 and 12 about Philippi. Philippi is kind of an interesting city. It's described here in verse 12 as being a Roman colony. That's pretty important. Roman colonies were little towns or cities that would be settled by retired Roman soldiers. Here you'd have maybe a bunch of, retired veterans, and they're all kind of sitting around and maybe, all right, well, what can we do with these guys? They still want to maybe be of service, but, they're not really in a position to be able to go to war. They're not as young and as fit as some of our other soldiers, so what can we do with them? Well, the Romans were very, very smart. We're going to take a bunch of these veterans and we'll just place them in these new territories that we've kind of seized and overtaken, and we're going to have them just kind of colonize, and they're going to take up a lot of the area there. And what that does is that then gives that town, that city, that area a very Roman flavor. You take a bunch of former military guys kind of walking around, maybe they've still got some of that military swagger about them, and it's just going to give a very Roman flavor, going to kind of put Roman seasoning in that area. You see some of these guys walking around and, oh, okay, it's going to be a constant reminder that the Romans are the ones who have the authority and they're in charge. In a lot of ways, these towns would then become like little satellites of Rome. You couldn't exactly take Rome exactly as it was and put it into other places, but you could kind of create little miniature versions of Rome in all these little towns, which would then kind of, Hellenize the world at that time. And so that's what we've got going on here in Philippi. One of the benefits of living in a Roman colony is you then got to enjoy all the rights and the privileges of Roman citizenship, being in a place like that, and being a citizen in a town like that. The city of Philippi in particular is made up of, it seems like, three main classes or three main groups of people. The first would be these Roman colonists. Secondly, would have been like kind of the native people, the native Macedonians. The third group, though, and this probably would have been the smallest part of the population, would have been some folks who had traveled from the east. Some folks maybe of kind of Oriental descent, but that would also include even some Jews. And the reason I emphasize some Jews is because there seems to be indication in the text that there wasn't a very heavy Jewish population there in Philippi. How do I know that? Look at the very next verse, verse 13. Verse 13, and on the Sabbath day, does your Bible say that they went to the synagogue, as is usually the case with Paul? No. Doesn't seem as if there was a synagogue in Philippi. And so instead, on the Sabbath day, we went outside the gate of the city to the riverside, where we supposed that there was a place of prayer, and we sat down and we spoke to the women who had come together. There is not a synagogue, it seems, here in the city of Philippi. According to Jewish tradition, kind of the rules, this was not something that was legislated in the Word of God. This was something that rabbis and teachers, these were parts of their traditions and parts of their just their own kind of man-made rules, was that you couldn't have a synagogue somewhere unless you had at least 10 Jewish men. Needed to have 10 heads of families to be able to then create and start a synagogue. And so whether there was no Jewish men here in the city, or maybe there just wasn't enough to get to the number 10, the end result is that we don't have a synagogue. And so in the absence of having 10 Jewish men to be able to establish a synagogue, the rule was, again, this is once again just kind of the words and the teaching of the rabbi, was that you were then decreed to go and meet together in some public space, particularly by open water. And so what are we looking for? Paul comes to town looking for a synagogue first. Well, there's not a synagogue. All right, well, where might some Jewish people be found? Well, let's go look for somewhere out here in the open, and let's go looking for some bodies of water. And lo and behold, there is a river there just outside the city gates, and lo and behold, he does find some Jewish people gathered there. We're mentioned here in verse 13 about that there are women here. I don't know that completely eliminates that there were no men at all in that assembly. I think maybe it could just be indication this was predominantly women here, but there are women that have gathered together here. And of course, this is still Paul kind of fitting in with his normal custom, all right? Even though we're not in the synagogue, my main thing when I come into a new town is I'm looking for spiritually minded folks. I'm looking for folks who maybe already know something about the God of heaven. Even better if they know something about the Scriptures. These seem to fit that particular bill. We've got some folks who are interested in spiritual things, and so Let's talk with them. And the talking that does take place here, notice the wording that's used. Actually, let's keep reading there, verse 14. Verse 14, we sat down and we spoke to the women who had come together, verse 14, and one who heard us was a woman named Lydia from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple goods, who was a worshiper of God. And the Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was said by Paul. And after she was baptized, and her household as well, she urged us, saying, "If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay." And she prevailed upon us. You know, the talking that's going on here, it says that they spoke with them. I think this is more than just, oh, hey, how are you doing? Good to meet you. Just kind of small talk conversation. I think probably this is an indication of kind of more conversational type teaching. Maybe akin to sort of what we're doing tonight, where it's kind of a Bible study in the sense that we're sharing ideas and talking back and forth. I think that's probably the implication here. And they're learning from Paul and Silas and the others who were gathered there. Lydia, in verse 14, is the one who is singled out in particular. We're told that she is an out-of-town visitor herself, and we probably take note of the fact that it seems like she is maybe kind of by herself. Now, there is going to be mention here in just a second that she and all her household respond to the gospel, but I want us to be careful about not reading the word household and automatically assuming that that's talking about family members. That's our kind of 21st century definition of household, but that may not necessarily be what that means here. Her household may have been employees, people who work for her. She's a businesswoman. She's a seller of purple. Might even be an indication that she's a very successful businesswoman, maybe a wealthy businesswoman. Of course, purple was the color of royalty, and it was an expensive item to be able to purchase. The dye that was used to make garments purple was very valuable, and so she herself might have been quite the entrepreneur herself. So this household may very well, in fact, be her, and may just be a bunch of other women that she kind of has in her employ. Maybe it's other family members. We do take note, though, that there's no mention here of a husband. And so we maybe assume maybe she's a divorced woman. It might be more likely maybe she is a widowed woman. There may be children involved, but we can't say that even conclusively either. It's just her and a bunch of other people that are, she's kind of the head of this household, it seems, with all of these other folks. It is most likely that she is a Gentile. Her name has Greek and Latin origins, but on top of all of that, notice what Luke says, the word that he uses there to describe her, that she was a worshiper of God. That's the same kind of language that Luke has used to describe people like Cornelius, the God-fearers. These are people who, they believe in God, they have respect and fear for God. In this particular instance, that then causes her to worship God. She maybe doesn't have a full knowledge of everything, maybe has not fully proselyted to the Jewish faith, but she's got some working knowledge. And the fact that she is a God-fearer, she is incredibly fertile soil. These are exactly the kind of people that Paul and the other apostles were looking for and just loved to be able to work with whenever they encountered them and have an opportunity to teach them. And so, we find that she is incredibly fertile soil. The words that are used there in verse 14, when it says that the Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was said by Paul, that is an expression that you need to know and maybe just kind of prepare yourself for whenever you're talking to folks who espouse Calvinistic ideas. Because Calvinism teaches, and Calvinists will say, that unless God directly, miraculously works upon a person's heart, then that person can't ever be saved. It is God choosing the people that He's selected, the people that He's predestined, who are going to be saved. God has to do a special working on their heart individually in order for that person to then be able to be open and receptive to the gospel, and so they can then receive the salvation that God has for them. The whole idea here, and they'll use this verse in at the end of verse 14 to say that God chooses those people, and He does that by operating on a person's heart so that they can hear and receive the gospel. I would just say to you, that is not what this passage is teaching. We could look at a bunch of other passages in Scripture to help diffuse all of that. But I think if we're just looking here contextually, if we'll notice the fact that Paul's already been talking with them in the previous verses, Paul's already been doing some teaching. I think we can understand then what this phrasing means when it says that the Lord opened up her heart. This is teaching that Lydia's heart was opened up by what? By the gospel, by the Word of God. That's how the Lord opens up people's hearts. And the fact of the matter is, it's no different today, is it? A person's heart is opened up by the hearing of the Word, when they are convicted by the Word. And we know especially that Lydia was convicted by the Word because she then acts upon it. The very next verse, verse 15, after she was baptized. I would almost suggest to you, in a lot of ways, we don't ever use this verse to talk about the necessity of baptism, but I actually think it's a really great verse to use to show that. Because just look at the matter-of-fact way that Luke talks about her baptism. He just says, after she was baptized. As if to say, of course she was baptized. What else do people do when they hear the gospel and are convicted by the gospel? Yeah, she was baptized. I don't even need to, Luke's probably thinking, I don't even need to belabor that. Everybody understands you're baptized when you have faith that then leads you to action and to respond to the call of the gospel. Cody. That's right. That's a great point. Cody's made the point for those who couldn't hear is that the common teaching today is that baptism is an act that causes a person to be to be admitted into a denomination, be admitted membership into a church. Well, there's none of that here, because there was not a local church here in Philippi. As best we can tell, probably Lydia, her household, and whoever else might have been converted that day, they really kind of formed the beginnings of the church in Philippi, and it's going to become a church that's going to become very near and dear to Paul's heart. But you're right, that's not what the purpose of baptism is. Baptism puts you into Christ, and yes, the Lord then adds you to His body, adds you to the church universal. But there's nothing here about baptized into a congregation or anything along those lines. What else? I want to say something about Lydia's comments there in verse 15, but what do you want to say down through this section thus far? Dole.
It kind of reminds me of the eunuch. She was sincere just like the eunuch was.
Yep.
He had to be taught.
Yep. That's exactly right. The only thing she's missing, she knows who the Lord is. She's worshiping the correct God. She's got some working knowledge. She just needs more information. And so it was with the eunuch, so it was with Cornelius, so it was with Saul of Tarsus. You get these people the information that they need. When you got sincere hearts, that's what sincere people do, is they act upon it accordingly. What else here? Well, let me say something there about what she says there at the end of verse 15. After she is baptized, after she becomes a Christian, she says to them, urging them, if you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay. And then notice the little kind of tag that Luke then puts at the end of that, and she prevailed upon us. Probably what that indicates to us is that here's this woman, she comes up out of the water. She's eager to begin living the Christian life, and she's looking for opportunities to start acting upon her newfound faith. And of course, for her, one of the first things she thinks of is, well, these guys are visiting from out of town. Well, I've got a house here in town, maybe have some extra room in this town. I'm sure these guys would probably like a nice place to stay, probably a nice meal. I'm going to guess that probably the bed and the meal that they got the night that they stayed at Lydia's house was probably a lot better than lots of the others that they had in the previous nights leading up to this on this particular trip. We don't know if Lydia maybe owned a second house here in Philippi. We're told that she's from Thyatira. She may have just been in town for a temporary period of time. It is worth noting that the city of Philippi, it lies right along a very famous and important Roman road called the Egnatian Way. And that was oftentimes a place where merchants would set up because it got lots of traffic. This is like, what's the big yard sale? Is it the 127? Yeah, the 127 yard sale. That road gets lots of traffic. And so folks every year set up along the roadside because they know there's going to be lots of opportunities to sell your stuff. And so that was not uncommon along the Egnatian Way. And so here's Lydia there in town doing some of that. She's got this house. Hey, won't you guys stay here for the night? You know, you've had some long travels and you've worked hard. You know, let me be able to show you and provide you some hospitality. That last statement, though, that she prevailed upon us, indicates to us that they resisted, at least initially. No, we can't, or we better not. And we don't know the reasons for this. One translation actually says she urged us until we agreed. Maybe, you know, Paul and Silas, and, you know, it was a bunch of men, you know, maybe they thought, you know, just for purposes of propriety, we don't want to give a wrong impression. Maybe it might not be good for us to come and stay in the house with, you know, a single woman and maybe a bunch of other women. Maybe that wouldn't be proper for us. Maybe, knowing Paul's, you know, kind of attitude and temperament and demeanor, Paul may have been, thanks, but we got to go. You know, we got other places we need to go. I got all these places I'm wanting to hit. It could be a number of reasons. But eventually, she wears them down. And I read this passage, and it makes me think of just a practical thing that maybe we don't talk about very much, but it needs to be talked about. And that is when others, and especially when people who are of the household of faith, try to extend kindness to us, whether it's an invitation to be hospitable, an invitation to come to my house, have a meal, maybe it's an invitation to go out to eat and I'll buy you dinner. Maybe it's something else, some other act of kindness or generosity. We probably shouldn't always be so quick to do what we are often quick to do, and that is to politely decline those offers. Oh, no, I wouldn't want to put you out. You don't need to go to all that trouble for me. You know, I'm fine, we'll be okay. I'm reminded of what a sister, and it was an elderly sister a couple of years ago, I was preaching in a meeting up in Louisville. And at the end of the week, this elderly sister came to me and she brought me a card. And in that card, she had wrote some nice things, but also included in that was a $100 bill. And she wanted me to have that. And I went to her before I left that evening, before I was on my way back home, and I said, "Sister, what are you giving me this money for? The church gave me a check for coming and preaching this week. You don't need to give me this." And she said, "I know, honey." But she said, "I also know that we had Hattie, and she's like, I know you've got a young family." And she's like, I just wanted to do it. She said, "I can, and I wanted to do it. And here I am, I'm trying, no, you keep this, you find somebody else who's in need, we're doing okay." She said, "Honey, please, don't steal my blessing." And that's stuck with me ever since then. Don't steal my blessing. And I wonder how many times when a brother or a sister offers some kindness, invites us over to their house to eat, invites us out somewhere, offers to do something, hey, let me babysit your kids, or whatever it is, how many times we decline those things, and in doing so, we rob that person of their blessing. I'm reminded of what Paul is going to say when we get to chapter 20 as he quotes the words of Jesus. It is more blessed to give than to receive. We need to think about that more. That sometimes somebody comes and offers us something like that, to do some kind of a kindness, they're just trying to do what the Lord said. They're just trying to be a giver. And we need to be willing and ready to receive that. I understand about trying to be polite and some of the courtesies with all of that, but I don't know. Especially when it's brethren to brethren, I think our knee-jerk reaction needs to be yes and thank you and I love you for that. And I think we can kind of learn something here from Lydia and her situation. What else do you want to say about that? Anything down through verse 15?
She just wouldn't take no for an answer.
Nope.
And sometimes we'll offer and they go, no. She wouldn't take no for an answer. If you go back and look at what that word that's prevailed or constrained actually means there, was it could be employed, force contrary to nature and right, or compelled by employing force, or by entreaty. So in other words, it's strong. In other words, I just pretty much grab you and drag you.
Yeah.
Won't take no for an answer.
Sometimes if you've ever been in the position of, you offer to somebody and you invite, maybe there just almost comes a point where you've been told no enough, you know what, I'm not taking no for an answer this time. I'm going to grab you and take you to my house if I have to, or I'm going to take you across the street and give you a taco. Whatever it takes, you're not taking my blessing away. I want to have that opportunity. And I don't know, there's just something beautiful about that in a lot of ways. Even though it is a forceful term, it just shows the kind of zeal that we ought to have to want to serve and to do things like that. Tom? Yeah.
What better opportunity than a man who just converted you to come and help me learn what I need to do?
That's right. That's a great point. And especially, some of the most valuable teaching I know that I've ever learned in my life did not happen in a formal kind of assembly setting. Lots of times it just happened sitting around a table with somebody, sitting in a living room with a brother or a sister or a mother or a father or a grandparent or whoever it may be. And she's wanting, I think you're probably right, that she does want as much of that as she can possibly get before these guys head out of town. And again, it's just the eagerness that we see in these people who were the God-fearers, and just kind of lends even more support to why it was so important for the early church to be evangelizing to Gentiles, because these folks had a hunger and a thirst for righteousness. I think Lydia is a great example of that. Anything else down through verse 15? Well, as is usually the case, whenever you have great successes in the book of Acts, what's that usually followed by? Well, that's usually followed by something negative and something not so good. And that's what happens beginning in verse 16. So we're still going to stay here in Philippi, kind of work here for several days, verse 16. And so as we were going to the place of prayer, we were met by a slave girl who had a spirit of divination, and it brought her owners much gain by fortune telling. Let's just stop right there and talk about the situation here with this slave girl and her owners, her masters. You may have a marginal note about this when it says that she had a spirit of divination. You may have something along the lines of Python or Python or Pythonia or something along those lines. This woman, this young lady, or however old she might have been, she is a Pythoness. That is, the Python was the serpent god. You see that just in the name, Python. It was kind of a snake, dragon type god that was worshipped in that particular region of the world. This is not far from the famous Oracle of Delphi. And if you read any of the history about the Oracle of Delphi, that was the place where people would often go to have fortunes told. And the people there who did that kind of stuff really just kind of had it mastered. They had a whole, show, essentially, to cause folks to really think that they were receiving, real fortune telling, real people who were telling the future. That would be done by elaborate rituals that would involve smoke and hallucinogenics, to where folks would then, they'd come in and they would breathe these hallucinogenics in the air, and it would then cause them to become discombobulated. They would then start speaking in all kinds of gibberish. Then a priest would be standing nearby, and he would, quote unquote, interpret what that person was saying, and that supposedly is supposed to be, they were telling you your fortune. That was just telling the future for your particular issue. This slave girl, the one difference in her and what was going on in that region at that time is, in a lot of ways, she's actually legitimate. Because she's not under the influence of drugs. She is possessed by an actual demonic spirit. Now, we've not seen demon possession going on a whole lot here in these middle chapters of Acts, but it is still present in that first century world, and it was still a problem. And oftentimes whenever I've studied this and talked about this story, I often tend to just kind of rush right past this slave girl. In fact, I'm usually pretty quick to get to verse number 18, and the stuff that it says about Paul and how he reacts to this demon-possessed slave girl. But we need to just camp here for just a second and recognize what a pitiful condition this girl is in. We don't have demon possession today, and so we really can't even sympathize or even fully begin to understand what it was like to be possessed by a demon. We need to then couple that with the fact that she is a slave. One author wrote about that, and he said this. He said, "You couldn't sink much lower in public estimation than to be a slave, a female slave. That meant she owned nothing, not even herself. She had no possessions, no rights, no liberty, no life of her own. Even the money that she earned by fortune telling, it went straight into her master's pockets, not hers. She had lost her identity, her individuality as a human being. If socially she belonged as a slave to her masters, then psychologically she belonged to that spirit which controlled her. She was in double bondage." I don't know, just reading that and thinking about all that, it would have been a tough road to hoe for this girl to have to live this particular way. And in a lot of ways, it's really kind of a stark contrast to what we just read about Lydia. How the Lord was able to open up her heart through the teaching of the Word. And here is this young lady, her heart in many ways, it is imprisoned. Imprisoned by this demonic force, not only that, but also the enslavement in which she lived under. And so she's being used. I mean, she's really like a piece of property. That's really about how this girl is being treated by her masters. She's a piece of property. She's an asset to our business. And so, verse 17, what does she do? Well, verse 17 tells us that she followed Paul and us, crying out, "These men are servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to you the way of salvation." I want you to notice that despite the miserable conditions that this girl had to live in, what the slave girl is saying, at least what's coming out of her mouth, whether she has a whole lot of control over that or not, what the demon is saying through her is actually true. I mean, the statement that is made here, it is a true statement. It is a statement of truth. You know, we saw this in the Gospels. We saw this in the Gospel of Mark. Not everything that demons said was wrong. Now, the things that demons do, the things that demons are wrong. But oftentimes demons understood things about the truth. You think about that passage later in the New Testament. It talks about how, even the demons believe. They know some stuff. They know some stuff about Jesus. They have some knowledge of what truth is. They just don't do the correct thing with that truth. And so what this demon is saying through this girl, it is absolutely right. However, this is not the kind of advertisement that Paul or Silas or any of these guys is looking to get. Can you imagine, if, I don't know, some atheist or somebody who's a practicing known homosexual or somebody who is a known drug addict and is just overtaken with that, they decided to camp up right here, right next to Ritchie Lane, and they hold up signs and come to the Lakeside Church of Christ. This is the place where you'll be taught the Word of God. I'm not so sure that would be the best kind of advertisement for the work that we're trying to do. And in fact, Paul seems to be bothered by this constant advertisement coming from the mouth of what is a known demon-possessed girl. Stop and think about this. If people know that this girl is demon-possessed, if people know and have some idea about the weird, mysterious religions that all this kind of soothsaying and the fortune-telling was associated with, then we don't want to have any kind of association with that. We don't want people to think that the way of salvation that's being talked about here has anything to do with these false religions. And so Paul is very bothered by this, and the text tells us so. Verse 18, "This she kept doing for many days, and so Paul, having become greatly annoyed, turned and said to the spirit, 'I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her.' And it came out that very hour." Now, there are, I think, maybe some logical questions that we might have about this. Maybe one of the first things that we wonder is, all right, if this was such a nuisance for Paul, if this was so problematic, then why didn't he do it sooner? Why didn't he the first day that this demon-possessed girl is crying this stuff out, why didn't he just stop it right then, cast the demon out, nip that in the bud right away? I don't know the answer to that specifically. What we know, though, is that Paul's annoyance with her is not that he thinks she's a pest in some way. I don't think that's the way that we need to read that. What Paul sees here is that the things that is coming out of this girl's mouth, it is a hindrance to the gospel. It's causing barriers. It's not helping. I'm sure this demon thinks, oh, I'm doing a great work here telling folks that this is how you find salvation, is to talk to these guys. No, it's causing problems. It's going to cause huge problems. It's going to cause lots of confusion and mixed signals in people's minds. And so Paul, we need that stopped. And what Paul does is the exact same thing that we saw Jesus do before him, where Jesus would rebuke a demonic spirit, and it would be an immediate casting out. I immediately think about the guy there on there in Gennesaret. Was that the name of the place? The demoniac man. Jesus cast the demon out of him. Actually had multiple demons and put them in the pigs, and they went rushing down the hill. It was an immediate change, and there was an immediate change in this girl, and we know that because of what's going to happen next. What else do you want to say here about this girl and about her affliction, Kent?
and the Lord made him hush because he didn't want it to be known in that fashion. That was a hindrance because he was doing what he was doing, and he didn't need a demon to stick his fingers in the plan of God and what he was doing. And
That's right.
here Paul was trying to teach them the gospel and convert people with truth rather than having a demonic person try to convince people, and she's telling the truth, we better obey. Well, don't obey because she's
Right.
You better obey because what I'm saying really is the truth.
That's right. It's just not the best. It'd be like if some porno website came to us and said, "Hey, we'd like to advertise your church on our website." Whoa! That just ain't going to work. There's just some major incompatibility there. And there's some incompatibility here. And you're right. The teaching that Paul and Silas and these guys are doing, that's more than enough to convince people. We don't need all this extra shouting and stuff coming from a demon-possessed person. We've got Spirit-inspired men who are able to just teach the gospel as it is, and that's more than enough to help folks become Christians. What else, Tom?
Think about Paul's not going to be there long. And this demon already setting it up where this girl, when Paul and them leave, and people be listening to this demon, and this girl's talking. So he'll be gone, but this girl will have people say, wow, she already said this, and the demon, they'll have control of the people then.
That's a good point. Yeah, that could be a possibility. Maybe there was kind of almost a sinister reason why the demon was saying this, going to kind of use truth. It's kind of what I preached Sunday night about the hand and the puppet thing. All right, I'm going to say something truthful, but it's not because we want people to believe the truth. It's as soon as Paul gets out of here, we're going to, folks will see us as being authoritative in the things that are coming from this girl's mouth. That's a good observation. Mom.
Do you think that maybe Paul waited because of, as far as trying to tell the demon to get out of her, because of him knowing how her owners would react and that their preaching would get stopped?
That's a good point. That may very well be the reason as to why he waited. Those who couldn't hear is that Paul, knew that once he cast this demon out, that's going to cause a problem for the owners of this slave girl, and they probably are going to have some problems. And that is exactly what happens next. So Paul's probably trying to milk this as long as I can, but boy, just imagine hearing this, day after day after day. I don't even know what the voice of a demonic, possessed slave girl sounds like, but it probably wasn't music to anybody's ears, and we need that stopped. Verse 19 then, let's just see the problem then. Verse 19, but when her owners saw that their hope of gain was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the rulers. Luke's gospel is the gospel that really contains most, if not all, of Jesus' teachings about money. And once again, Luke is the one who shows us here the problem is money. That's the issue here. Soon as the demon is gone, these owners see that, our profits are gone too. The demon goes out the window, so too does our money, so too does our wealth and our prosperity. They see, as I said earlier, this slave girl, being possessed like this, she was an asset. She's something they would write off on their, taxes at the end of the year. Because she's a piece of property that we use to manage our business and to get stuff done. And now that that's gone, you don't go messing with somebody's pocketbook. You don't go messing with our bottom line. That's going to cause problems. And so they forcibly lay hold on Paul and Silas. I would already suggest to you that was the first mistake that these people made. They forcibly dragged them into the marketplace before the rulers. Verse 20, and when they had brought them to the magistrates, they said, these men are Jews, and they are disturbing our city. They advocate customs that are not lawful for us as Romans to accept or practice. There's almost a slight hint of anti-Semitism going on here. Do you hear that? We're Romans, they're Jews. And we know how we think about the Jews, don't we? We're better than them. And what they're doing is not just that we don't like them because they're different than us. No, we don't like them because of what they're doing. And what do they accuse Paul and Silas of doing? Well, what they accuse them of here in these two verses is they accuse them of what is called religio illicita. That is, illegal religion. It was against Roman law to introduce an entirely new religion in an imperial city or territory. We need to be reminded that Christianity at this point in time, it is not a licensed religion. It's not. In order to have a license, you had to actually go through procedures for the Roman government to acknowledge that you are an official religion so you can practice that and teach that and spread that. Somebody would maybe then ask the question, well, how come Christianity hadn't been stopped yet up to this point? And the answer to that is because the Romans, up to this point, they still just viewed Christianity as just another sect of Judaism. Judaism was a licensed religion. And so to them, it just seemed like, it's just another branch of Judaism. Yeah, they've got their little quirks, but so too does this branch of Judaism and that branch of Judaism, and there's all these different branches of Judaism. So, it's just another one of those. Of course, we know the fact that Christianity is not a branch of Judaism. It does grow out of Judaism, grows out of the teaching of the Old Testament, but it's not another, twig on the branch of Judaism. So they're charged with, hey, these guys are coming in here and doing something illegal. And yet the fact of the matter is, the people who drag them out, and the people who are prosecuting them right now, and the people who are going to do the next things that happens in the next couple of verses, this is the illegal activity. Verse 22. Verse 22, then the crowd joined in attacking them, and the magistrates tore the garments off of them, gave orders to beat them with rods. And when they had inflicted many blows upon them, they threw them into prison, ordering the jailer to keep them safely. And having received this order, he put them into the inner prison and fastened their feet in the stocks. What happens in verses 22 through 24 is an outright violation of Roman law. Roman law exempted Roman citizens from degrading punishment or imprisonment without first getting a proper trial. Due process needs to take place first. And due process has been completely skipped over here. We're just going straight to laying hands on these guys, and we're stripping their clothes off of them, and we're beating them with rods, and we're hitting them, and any way that we can get a blow in on these guys. Then we're going to toss them into prison, and not just any part of the prison. Notice verse 24 says, putting them into the inner prison. That was considered kind of like the third layer of the prison, the deepest part of a prison. It's really like a dungeon. Would have been the stinkiest part of the prison, all kinds of stale air. Would have been the part of the prison where if it was summertime, it would have been the hottest of the hot. If it was in the wintertime, it would have been the coldest of the cold. This is the place where you put the baddest of the bad, the worstest kinds of criminals. Paul and Silas have been tossed in there. Now, somebody's going to ask, well, how are they to know that these guys were Roman citizens? How is somebody to know that Paul was a Roman citizen? How is somebody to know that Silas was a Roman citizen? And the answer is, don't know. I don't know how a person went about proving their Roman citizenship in that time. If somebody pulls me over, I'm able to pull out my ID and say, hey, I'm registered as a citizen in the state of Kentucky, in the United States of America. I can just flash that. I'm guessing they probably didn't have ID cards that they just pulled out of their robes in first century times to show that they were Roman citizens. So there's just always lots of speculation as to how that was done. Regardless, this was improper. It was improper in every way, and in fact, at the end of the chapter, Paul's going to point out how improper all of these activities were. I would maybe, if you want to just make a note here, in 1 Thessalonians 2 and verse 2, Paul makes a reference to these events. And he talks about how the brethren in Thessalonica, hey, you guys know how terribly mistreated, how publicly shamed we were when we came through Philippi, and you guys know about that, and you sympathize with the things that we had to experience. We'll have to stop right there. Derek's rung the bell on us, and so next week we'll then get to talk about what happened when Paul and Silas are in prison. Very famous story. Be thinking about the applications that we want to make from that great conversion story. Thank you, everybody, for your attention tonight.